I hope she passes away before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow, freezing my hand over the stack of vendor invoices spread across my kitchen table. I was 68 years old, a widow of 3 years, and I had just heard my beloved granddaughter wish for my passing. Then I'd get the inheritance too and could plan the wedding I actually want. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. Madison's voice drifted from the living room where she thought she was alone, speaking casually on the phone as if discussing weekend plans rather than my demise. The invoice in my trembling hand was from the florist, $3,000 for arrangements I'd personally selected, thinking we were creating memories together. How naive I'd been. I set down my pen and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs as the conversation continued. Every word was a knife twist, revealing the depth of deception I'd been blind to for months. Grandma keeps trying to give her opinions about everything. So embarrassing. My friends keep asking why she's so involved in planning my wedding. The casual cruelty in her tone made my stomach lurch. This was Madison, the little girl I'd raised when her parents worked double shifts, the teenager I'd supported through her first heartbreak, the young woman I'd offered to make dreams come true for. And she was discussing me like I was a burden to be disposed of. But those first devastating words kept echoing. I hope she passes away before the wedding. I remained perfectly still, hardly breathing, as more of Madison's true feelings spilled out. Each revelation painted a picture of manipulation so complete, so calculated, that I began to question everything I thought I knew about my own granddaughter. I wish she'd just pay for it and stay out of it, Madison continued, and I could hear her pacing. She always paced when she was getting worked up about something. And honestly, sometimes I think about what it would be like if she just wasn't around anymore. Like if she passed away tomorrow, I wouldn't have to deal with all her opinions and interference. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My own granddaughter wasn't just complaining about me. She was actively wishing I was gone. The girl I'd loved unconditionally for 24 years saw my passing as a convenient solution to her problems. I mean, I know it sounds terrible, but think about it. Madison's voice grew more animated, excited even. If she passed away before the wedding, I wouldn't have to deal with her trying to control everything, and I'd inherit whatever money she has left. There it was. Not just a passing wish, but a calculated assessment of the benefits my demise would bring her. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling dizzy as the full scope of her betrayal became clear. She's got to have at least $1 million saved up. She owned that restaurant for 20 years, plus whatever Grandpa left her. If she was gone now, I'd get all that money and could plan the wedding I actually want, not the one she's trying to force on me. I closed my eyes, seeing my entire relationship with Madison in a new, horrible light. Every hug, every thank you, every moment of apparent gratitude. Had it all been performance? Had she been calculating my worth while pretending to love me? God, Ashley, I know how awful this sounds, but honestly, I hope she passes away before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. Then I'd get the inheritance too and could plan the wedding I actually want. The repetition made it worse somehow. This wasn't a momentary thought spoken in anger. This was a carefully considered wish, repeated for emphasis. My granddaughter wanted me gone, and she wanted to profit from it. I stood on shaking legs and walked to my home office, my mind reeling with implications I was only beginning to understand. For months, I'd been planning what I thought was the wedding of Madison's dreams, spending my savings to give her everything she claimed to want. But apparently what she really wanted was for me to disappear. The filing cabinet where I kept important documents seemed to mock me. 20 years of running Evelyn's table had taught me to read contracts carefully, to understand the fine print, to protect my interests. But I'd failed to protect myself from the person I trusted most. As I pulled out the wedding contracts, every single one signed with my name as primary client, I began to smile for the first time in weeks. Madison had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed I was just a sweet, naive grandmother who didn't understand business. She'd assumed I was trapped by my own generosity, too kind-hearted to ever protect myself from those who would take advantage of me. She was about to learn how wrong she was about her grandmother. The contracts spread across my desk told a clear story. Maple Ridge Country Club, Elegant Events Catering, Morrison Photography, Bella Flora Designs. Every vendor relationship was between them and me, not Madison. I wasn't just financing her dream wedding. I was the actual client purchasing services I could cancel at will. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Thanks for everything, Grandma. You're the best. Can't wait to celebrate together in 3 weeks." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. 3 weeks. That's all the time I had left in her ideal scenario. 3 weeks before my passing would solve all her problems and deliver her the inheritance she'd already calculated down to the dollar. I typed back. "Looking forward to it, sweetheart. We need to talk soon about some final details." It wasn't a lie. We did need to talk. But the conversation would be nothing like what Madison expected. As I sat there surrounded by contracts worth $80,000, contracts that made me the decision maker, not just the funding source, I realized Madison had made another critical miscalculation. She'd told her friend Ashley that I was trapped by these agreements, that I was too sweet to ever take action that might hurt her. She was about to discover that 20 years of running a successful business had taught me exactly when and how to cut my losses. My granddaughter wanted me gone. She wanted to plan her own wedding without my interference. She wanted my inheritance more than my presence. I could arrange all three. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood as I sat in my kitchen replaying Madison's words. But beneath the hurt lay something harder. The methodical mind that had built Evelyn's table from nothing into a thriving business. I needed to understand how completely I'd been deceived. Opening my laptop, I began documenting everything with the same precision I'd once used for inventory and vendor relationships. If Madison thought she was dealing with a doddering old woman, she was about to learn otherwise. The pattern of manipulation stretched back further than I'd initially realized. When had Madison's behavior actually changed? When had genuine affection transformed into calculated performance? I pulled out my calendar and began marking incidents that had seemed minor at the time but now revealed themselves as part of a larger deception. 2 months ago, the florist meeting where Madison dismissed my suggestion about white roses, my wedding flowers as old-fashioned and embarrassing. Not just different taste, but active humiliation of my preferences. 6 weeks ago, the discovery that Madison had removed my closest friends from the guest list without consulting me. She'd claimed it was about fitting the vibe, but now I understood it was about eliminating witnesses to my generosity. 1 month ago, finding out Madison had scheduled vendor meetings without me, making decisions about thousands of dollars I was spending. She'd said I didn't need to be there for every little detail, but these weren't little details. They were major components of an $80,000 event. Each incident took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of Madison's true feelings. She hadn't been protecting my time or managing details. She'd been systematically excluding me from decisions about my own money while keeping me invested enough to continue funding her dream. The guest list revision was particularly calculated. By removing my friends, Madison had eliminated the people most likely to praise my generosity in her presence, forcing her to acknowledge my role in creating her perfect day. Without Ruth, Dorothy, and my other longtime friends, there would be fewer voices talking about how wonderful grandmother Evelyn was being. I called Ruth to apologize for the confusion about her invitation. "Oh, honey, I assumed there was some mistake," Ruth said, her voice warm with understanding. Madison seemed so distant when I mentioned how excited I was about the wedding. I thought maybe she was just stressed. "What exactly did she say to you?" There was a pause. "Well, it was a little odd. She said the wedding was going to be very intimate, and that she hoped I'd understand if they had to keep it to people who really knew the couple well. I've known that girl since she was born, Evelyn. How much better could I know her?" The dismissal was even crueler than I'd realized. Madison hadn't just excluded my friends. She'd made them feel unwelcome, as if their decades-long relationships with our family meant nothing. "Ruth, you were always supposed to be invited." Madison made changes to the guest list without my knowledge. "But don't worry, things are going to be different than expected. After hanging up, I continued my investigation. I called Patricia Davis, my banker, and asked for a complete analysis of my financial position. If Madison was calculating my inheritance value, I needed to know exactly what she thought she'd be getting. Evelyn, your liquid assets total just over $850,000, Patricia said. That includes the inheritance from your sister Margaret last month. Plus your house is worth about $300,000 and it's completely paid off. Over $1 million. Madison's estimate had been conservative, which meant she'd been researching my finances more thoroughly than I'd realized. How much did she actually know about my accounts? Had she been asking her father Christopher about my financial situation? The thought made my stomach turn. Had my own son been feeding information to Madison about my wealth? Was this conspiracy deeper than just my granddaughter's greed? I needed to know the truth. That afternoon, I drove to Christopher's office at the insurance company where he worked as a claims adjuster. He seemed surprised but pleased to see me, which either meant he was genuinely innocent or an excellent actor. "Mom, what brings you by? Everything okay with the wedding planning?" I studied his face carefully. "Christopher, has Madison asked you any questions about my financial situation? About what she might inherit someday?" His expression shifted slightly. Not guilt but confusion. "That's an odd question. Why would you ask that? I need you to think carefully. Has she shown unusual interest in my finances lately? Asked about the restaurant sale, or William's life insurance, or Margaret's estate?" Christopher frowned, clearly trying to remember. "Well, she did ask me a few weeks ago about what you did with the money from selling Evelyn's table. She said she was worried you might be spending too much on the wedding, that she didn't want you to strain yourself financially." My heart sank. Madison had been researching my assets under the guise of concern for my financial well-being. The manipulation was even more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were comfortable, that you wouldn't have offered to pay for the wedding if you couldn't afford it. I told her about Margaret's inheritance because I thought it might ease her mind to know you had that cushion." Christopher paused, looking worried. "Mom, is something wrong? Did Madison say something inappropriate about money?" The innocent concern in my son's voice convinced me he wasn't part of any conspiracy. Madison had been using him, extracting information through feigned worry while planning to benefit from my death. Let's just say I've learned some disturbing things about Madison's real feelings regarding my involvement in her wedding. What kind of things? I almost told him then, almost shared the devastating truth about his daughter's death wish. But something held me back. Christopher would be torn between defending his daughter and supporting his mother, and I didn't want to put him in that position until I decided how to handle the situation. "I need to think some things through, son. But tell me, when you think about Madison's behavior lately, has anything seemed off to you?" Christopher considered this seriously. "She's been stressed about the wedding, definitely. Sometimes she seems overwhelmed by all the planning and sometimes she seems, I don't know, frustrated. Like the wedding is becoming more complicated than she wanted." "Frustrated with whom?" "I assumed with the whole process. Wedding planning is stressful, especially when it's as elaborate as what you're giving her." He paused. "She did mention once that she felt like she was losing control of her own wedding, that too many people had opinions about everything." "Too many people? Meaning me?" "Christopher, if you had to describe Madison's attitude toward me lately, what would you say?" My son looked uncomfortable with the question, which told me everything I needed to know. He'd noticed something but had been trying to ignore it or rationalize it away. "I think she's grateful but maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by how involved everyone is in the process. You know how independent she's always been. Having such an elaborate wedding means accepting a lot of input from people." "A lot of input from people." He couldn't bring himself to say that his daughter was treating me badly, but he'd noticed the tension. "Has Rebecca said anything?" I asked, referring to Christopher's wife. "She mentioned that Madison seemed a little short with you at the last vendor meeting she attended. But we figured it was just wedding stress." "Wedding stress?" The convenient excuse that covered a multitude of sins. I left Christopher's office with confirmation that my son and daughter-in-law had noticed Madison's behavior, but had chosen to minimize it rather than confront it. They'd prioritized keeping peace over protecting me, which meant I truly was on my own in dealing with this betrayal. That evening, I sat in my living room with a legal pad and began calculating the real cost of Madison's dream wedding, not just in money, but in dignity, respect, and emotional well-being. The financial numbers were staggering enough. $80,000 represented a significant portion of my liquid assets, money I'd planned to use for my own security and comfort in my later years. But I could afford it without serious hardship. The emotional cost was harder to quantify. Months of excitement about sharing this special time with Madison. Weeks of careful planning and coordination with vendors. Hours spent researching options and making arrangements. All of it undertaken with love and joy, believing I was creating precious memories with my granddaughter. Now I knew Madison had experienced those same moments as interference and embarrassment. Every suggestion I'd made had been an annoyance. Every vendor meeting had been an intrusion. Every expression of excitement had been something she endured rather than shared. But the calculation that hurt most was Madison's assessment of my life's value. In her mind, my death was worth more than my presence. She'd reduced me to a dollar figure and found my living self wanting in comparison. The hurt was almost overwhelming, but underneath it lay something stronger. Resolve. Madison thought she understood me, thought she had me figured out as a soft-hearted grandmother who could be manipulated through affection and gratitude. She'd gambled that my love for her would override any self-respect or business sense I might have. She was about to learn that she'd miscalculated badly. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Stone, the attorney who'd handled William's estate and had been my legal counsel during my restaurant years. Marcus, I need to discuss some contract cancellations. Can you see me first thing tomorrow morning? Of course, Evelyn. Is everything all right? Everything is about to be much clearer than it's been in a long time. Marcus Stone's law office hadn't changed much in the years since William's death. The same solid oak furniture, the same law books lining the walls, the same sense of competent professionalism that had guided me through the sale of Evelyn's table and the complexities of estate planning. Evelyn, you look troubled, Marcus said as I settled into the familiar chair across from his desk. What can I help you with? I spread the wedding contracts across his desk, the same documents I'd signed with such joy and anticipation just months earlier. I need to understand my legal position as the primary client on these service agreements. Marcus began examining the contracts with the methodical attention that had made him one of Springfield's most respected attorneys. As he read, I found myself studying his face for reactions, trying to gauge whether my situation was as clear-cut as I hoped. These are all signed with you as the contracting party, he said after several minutes. Not as a guarantor or financial backer, but as the actual client purchasing services. What's prompted this review? I've learned some disturbing things about how the intended beneficiary of these services actually feels about my involvement in the planning process. I'm considering cancellation. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd known me long enough to understand that I didn't make dramatic statements lightly. Evelyn, to be completely clear, you have every legal right to cancel these services according to the terms specified in each contract. The fact that they're intended for your granddaughter's wedding doesn't change your status as the client. What about the deposits I've already paid? That depends on the specific cancellation clauses, but from what I'm seeing here, you'd likely forfeit most of the deposits while avoiding the much larger final payments. He pulled out a calculator and began making notes. You've paid approximately $15,000 in deposits against a total contract value of $80,000. Canceling now would save you roughly $65,000. The numbers aligned with my own calculations, but hearing them confirmed by Marcus made the possibility feel more real. There's something else I need to tell you, I said, and then I shared the conversation I'd overheard, watching Marcus's expression grow increasingly grave as I revealed the depth of Madison's deception. When I finished, Marcus sat back in his chair, his professional composure cracked by obvious shock. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. That level of manipulation and callousness is difficult to comprehend, especially from a family member you've been so generous with. The question is whether my emotional response should override sound business judgment. This isn't just emotional response, Marcus said firmly. This is a business relationship gone bad. You've discovered that one party, in this case Madison, has fundamentally misrepresented their appreciation for your services and has been actively working against your interests while accepting your financial support. He leaned forward, his tone taking on the authoritative quality I remembered from our business dealings years ago. In any commercial context, you would terminate this relationship immediately. The fact that it involves family makes it more painful, but it doesn't change the fundamental business principle. You don't continue investing in people who don't respect you. What about the social and family ramifications? Those are real considerations, but they're separate from your legal rights. You can cancel these contracts for any reason or no reason at all. Whether you choose to exercise that right depends on factors beyond my legal expertise. Marcus paused, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Have you considered what this will mean for your relationship with Madison? And with Christopher and Rebecca? I'd been thinking about little else since overhearing Madison's phone conversation. The family fallout would be severe, potentially permanent. But I'd reached a conclusion that surprised even me. Marcus, I'm 68 years old. I've spent the last 3 years rebuilding my life after William's death, learning to be independent, learning to value my own dignity and well-being. The question isn't whether I can afford to cancel these contracts, it's whether I can afford not to. Meaning that if I continue funding someone who wishes I was dead, who calculates the value of my inheritance while accepting my generosity, who dismisses my business experience while depending on my financial support, what does that say about how I value myself? Marcus nodded slowly. I understand your position, and legally it's unassailable. If you decide to proceed with cancellations, I can prepare the necessary notices and ensure they're properly documented. What's the timeline for something like this? Most of these contracts have 30-day cancellation clauses. Since the wedding is 3 weeks away, you're within the window for most services. I'd recommend acting quickly if you're going to do it. Waiting much longer could affect your legal standing with some vendors. 3 weeks. In Madison's ideal world, I'd be dead by then anyway. So the timing seemed almost poetic. Marcus, prepare the cancellation notices. I'll let you know by tomorrow whether to send them. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were balanced now by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my restaurant days. Madison had made several critical errors in her campaign of manipulation. She'd underestimated my business acumen, misunderstood the nature of the contracts I'd signed, and most importantly, misjudged my character. She'd assumed that love equated to weakness, that generosity meant I'd accept disrespect, that age had made me vulnerable to exploitation. All of those assumptions were about to be tested. That afternoon, I called Patricia Davis at the bank to discuss the financial implications of the cancellation. Evelyn, you're talking about forfeiting $15,000 in deposits. That's not nothing, even for someone in your financial position. Patricia, you've been handling my accounts for over a decade. In your professional opinion, what would $15,000 in lost deposits represent as a percentage of my total assets? Less than 2% of your liquid assets. Financially speaking, it would be noticeable but not harmful. And if I invested that $65,000 I'd save in cancellation fees, what kind of return could I expect? Patricia paused, clearly intriguing by the analytical approach I was taking to what most people would consider an emotional decision. Conservatively, you could expect 4 to 6% annually. That's roughly $3,000 per year in additional income. $3,000 per year. Money that would compound over time rather than being spent on someone who saw my death as financially advantageous. The business case for cancellation was becoming stronger with every conversation. Patricia, there's something else. I want to review my estate planning documents. Specifically, I want to understand what changes I can make to my will and beneficiary designations. Of course. Are you considering modifications? I'm considering significant modifications. Can you arrange for me to meet with the estate planning attorney you work with? I'll set up a meeting for this week. Evelyn, can I ask what's prompted all of this financial planning activity? I've received some new information about how certain potential beneficiaries view their inheritance prospects. I need to make sure my assets go to people who will appreciate them. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the same vendor invoices I'd been reviewing when Madison's conversation shattered my world. But now, instead of seeing obligations and commitments, I saw something else. Choices. I had choices about how to spend my money, whom to trust with my generosity, and how to respond to betrayal. For months, I'd felt locked into Madison's vision of her perfect wedding, believing that my role was simply to fund her dreams and smile gratefully when she occasionally acknowledged my contribution. But I wasn't trapped. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a checkbook with grandmother attached. I was Evelyn Harper, a woman who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd navigated the complexities of entrepreneurship for 20 years, who'd survived widowhood and rebuilt her life on her own terms. I'd let sentiment and family loyalty cloud my judgment, but I hadn't lost my ability to make hard decisions when necessary. Madison wanted to plan her own wedding without my interference. She could do exactly that, with her own money. She wanted my inheritance more than my presence. She could wait for it like everyone else, assuming she was still included when the time came. She thought I was too naive about business to protect my own interests. She was about to get a master class in contract law and vendor relations. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the early days of Evelyn's table. I made a list of pros and cons for a major business decision. Pros of cancellation *. Immediate savings of $65,000. Self-respect and dignity preserved. Clear message about acceptable behavior. Resources available for personal enjoyment. No further funding of someone who wishes me dead. Cons of cancellation *. Loss of $15,000 in deposits. Family relationship damage. Social embarrassment for Madison. Disappointment of other family members. Potential for permanent estrangement. Looking at the list, I realized that most of the cons were actually about protecting Madison from the consequences of her own choices. The relationship damage was her doing, not mine. The social embarrassment would result from her behavior being exposed, not from any action I was taking. The family disappointment would come from learning the truth about Madison's character. The only real cost to me was the forfeited deposits, $15,000 to escape a situation where I was being systematically disrespected while funding someone who calculated the benefits of my death. $15,000 to reclaim my dignity. It was the best bargain I'd been offered in years. The morning of my decision dawned bright and clear, as if the universe was offering perfect weather for what would either be the most empowering or most destructive choice of my later life. I dressed carefully in my best business suit, the navy blue one I'd worn to important meetings during my restaurant years. If I was going to end my granddaughter's dream wedding, I would do it with the same professionalism I'd brought to every significant business decision. Marcus Stone had prepared all the cancellation notices, each one precisely worded to comply with the specific terms of every vendor contract. They sat in neat manila envelopes on my kitchen table, waiting for my final decision. 15 letters that would save me $65,000 and cost me a relationship with a granddaughter I'd loved more than my own life. But was it really costing me a relationship, or was it simply acknowledging that the relationship I thought I had never actually existed? I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of Madison's manipulation. The guest list with my friends removed. The vendor contracts signed in my name but excluding me from decisions. The invoice after invoice for services I was paying for but apparently had no right to influence. And echoing through it all, Madison's voice. I hope she dies before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. My phone rang. Madison's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, testing my ability to maintain normalcy while knowing what I knew. Hi, Grandma. I wanted to call and thank you again for everything you're doing. Tyler and I are so grateful, and we can't wait to celebrate with you in 3 weeks. The performance was flawless. Genuine warmth, believable excitement, perfect granddaughter behavior. If I hadn't heard her true feelings, I would have been touched by her call. It's my pleasure, Madison. I love you so much. I love you too, Grandma. You're the best. She loved me so much that she hoped I'd die before her wedding. She thought I was the best grandmother for funding her dream while she wished I wasn't around to see it. Madison, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Grandma. What is it? Are you happy with how the wedding planning has been going? Do you feel like you've had enough control over the decisions? There was a slight pause, the first crack in her performance. What do you mean? Everything's been wonderful. You've been so generous and helpful. I mean, do you feel like your voice has been heard? Like the wedding reflects what you and Tyler really want? Another pause, longer this time. Grandma, is something wrong? You sound different. I was different. I was no longer the naive woman who believed her granddaughter's gratitude was genuine. I've just been thinking about whether I've been too involved in the planning process. Whether maybe you'd prefer to handle more of the decisions yourself. No, everything's been perfect. I wouldn't change anything about how we've done this. The lie came so smoothly, with such practiced ease, that I marveled at Madison's skill. She'd been deceiving me for months with this level of competence. Well, that's good to hear. I'll let you go then. See you soon, sweetheart. Love you, Grandma. I hung up and stared at the phone, amazed by the disconnect between Madison's public persona and her private thoughts. She just told me she wouldn't change anything about our planning process while actively wishing I was dead so she could plan differently. The call had been a test, and Madison had failed it completely. I opened the first envelope and removed the cancellation letter for Maple Ridge Country Club, the venue where Madison had dreamed of dancing at her reception, where she'd envisioned the perfect photographs, where she'd planned to celebrate the beginning of her married life. My signature on the contract made me the client. My $1,500 deposit gave me cancellation rights. My 68 years of life experience told me that continuing to fund someone who wished I was dead would be the height of foolishness. I sealed the letter back in its envelope and moved to the next one. Elegant Events Catering. The 5-course dinner Madison had selected after excluding me from the tasting. The menu I was paying for but apparently had no right to influence. The $2,000 deposit I'd forfeit to avoid paying the remaining $12,000. One by one, I reviewed each cancellation letter, mentally calculating the financial and emotional costs. By the time I finished, the mathematics were clear. I would lose $15,000 in deposits but save $65,000 in final payments, and more importantly, I would preserve something that had no price tag. My self-respect. The phone calls began at 10 o'clock sharp, each one precisely timed according to the list Marcus had prepared. I started with the largest contracts and worked my way down, maintaining the same professional tone I'd used when closing Evelyn's table. Maple Ridge Country Club, this is Jennifer. Jennifer, this is Evelyn Harper. I need to cancel the wedding reception scheduled for 3 weeks from Saturday. Oh my goodness, Mrs. Harper. I'm so sorry to hear that. Is everything all right? There have been some family circumstances that require cancellation. I understand I'll forfeit my deposit, but I won't be responsible for the final payment. Let me pull up your contract. Yes, you're within the 30-day cancellation window, so you'll lose the $1,500 deposit but avoid the remaining $8,000 in charges. I'll send you written confirmation today. Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate your professionalism. The next call was to Elegant Events Catering, then Morrison Photography, then each vendor in turn. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Initial shock, confirmation of cancellation terms, and professional handling of an obviously difficult situation. By noon, I had systematically dismantled $80,000 worth of wedding dreams with 15 phone calls and the sacrifice of $15,000 in deposits. Madison's perfect wedding no longer existed. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Freedom. I made myself lunch and sat in my sunroom, looking out at the garden William and I had planted together years ago. The roses were blooming despite the season's challenges, their beauty undaunted by the harsh weather they'd endured. Sometimes survival required cutting back the dead growth to protect the healthy parts. Sometimes preservation meant sacrificing what looked beautiful on the surface to save what was genuinely valuable underneath. I was 68 years old, and I had just learned that it was never too late to stop accepting unacceptable behavior, even from people you loved. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Can't wait to see you at the final venue walkthrough tomorrow. This is going to be the most beautiful wedding ever." I stared at the message, marveling at the timing. Madison was expressing excitement about a venue that no longer existed for an event that would never happen, sent to a grandmother whose death she'd been anticipating. I typed back, "We definitely need to talk about the wedding plans. There have been some developments." Her response came immediately. "What kind of developments? Is everything okay? We'll discuss it when we talk. Nothing for you to worry about right now." That was technically true. Madison wouldn't need to worry about anything until she started receiving phone calls from confused vendors, probably within the next few hours. I spent the afternoon researching cruise packages to Alaska, something I'd always wanted to do but had never justified the expense. A luxury suite on a 2-week cruise would cost exactly $50,000. Less than I was saving by canceling Madison's wedding, but more than I'd ever spent on myself at one time. The symbolism was perfect. The money I'd saved by refusing to fund someone who wished I was dead would instead be invested in my own happiness and experiences. I booked the cruise that afternoon, selecting a suite with a private balcony and scheduling departure for the day after Madison's cancelled wedding. If my granddaughter wanted me gone, I would oblige, but on my own terms and at my own expense. The first call from Madison came at 4:30. "Grandma, I just got the strangest call from Maple Ridge. They said you cancelled the reception venue. But that can't be right, can it? There must be some mistake." I took a deep breath, preparing for the conversation that would change our family forever. "There's no mistake, Madison. I cancelled all the wedding vendors this morning." "What? But why? What happened?" The genuine confusion in her voice was almost convincing. She'd been lying to me so skillfully for so long that indignation came naturally when her deception was threatened. "I overheard your conversation with Ashley yesterday. The one where you said you hoped I would die before the wedding so you could get my inheritance and plan the wedding you actually wanted." The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost hear Madison's mind racing, trying to find an explanation or excuse that would salvage the situation. "Grandma, I was just stressed. I didn't mean." "You calculated my net worth, Madison. You said I was naive about business and that I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. You called me an embarrassing burden and said you couldn't wait to stop pretending to care about my opinions. I was just venting to a friend. I didn't mean any of it. You know I love you. You meant every word and we both know it. But you were wrong about something important. I'm not trapped by those contracts. I was the primary client, which means I had every right to cancel them." "But Grandma, the wedding is in 3 weeks. What am I supposed to do?" The panic in her voice might have moved me once, but now I heard only the fear of someone whose carefully constructed plan had collapsed. "That's not my problem to solve anymore, Madison. You wanted to plan your own wedding without my interference. Now you can. But I can't afford this kind of wedding on my own. You know Tyler and I don't have that kind of money. I know exactly what you can afford, Madison. You were planning a $5,000 wedding before I offered to help. You can still have that wedding. All my friends are expecting this beautiful reception at Maple Ridge. The invitations have already been sent. Then you'll have to explain to your friends why the plans changed. Perhaps you can tell them that you wished your grandmother was dead and she decided not to fund your dream wedding anymore. I didn't mean it like that. I was just frustrated with all the planning stress." "Madison, you didn't just say you were frustrated. You said you hoped I would die. You calculated how much money you'd inherit. You said I was naive and that I was trapped. Those weren't words spoken in frustration, Those were your true feelings. The silence stretched between us, filled with 24 years of what I'd thought was genuine love and what I now knew was calculated performance. "Please, Grandma," Madison's voice cracked, and for a moment she sounded like the little girl I'd once comforted after nightmares. "I'll apologize. I'll do anything. Just please don't ruin my wedding." "I'm not ruining your wedding, Madison. I'm simply not paying for it anymore. You can still get married. You just can't do it on my dime while wishing I was dead." I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. The calls would continue. From Madison, from Christopher, from Rebecca, from Tyler's family. Everyone would try to convince me that Madison's death wish was just stress, just poor word choice, just anything other than what it actually was. A calculated assessment of my value versus my money. But I was done being convinced to accept unacceptable behavior. That evening, as I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and the cruise brochure spread across my coffee table, I felt something I hadn't experienced since William's death. Anticipation for my own future. For 3 years I'd been living for other people, honoring William's memory, supporting Christopher's family, funding Madison's dreams. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make plans based purely on my own desires and interests. Alaska in 3 weeks. Glaciers and wildlife and luxury accommodations I'd never allowed myself to consider. The money I'd saved by refusing to fund my own humiliation would instead purchase experiences and memories that would belong entirely to me. My phone, even turned off, seemed to vibrate with the weight of missed calls and unread texts. But for the first time in months, the urgent needs and demands of others felt distant and manageable. I had made my choice. Madison would have to live with hers. The next 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls, accusations, and family drama that confirmed everything I'd suspected about Madison's character and my family's priorities. Christopher called first, his voice tight with stress and confusion. "Mom, what's going on? Madison is hysterical. She says you canceled her entire wedding." "I canceled the wedding I was paying for, yes. Madison is free to plan whatever celebration she can afford on her own." "But why? What happened between you two?" I found myself facing the same decision I'd been avoiding. How much of Madison's betrayal to reveal to her parents? Christopher deserved to know the truth, but I also recognized that learning his daughter had wished for his mother's death would devastate him. "Christopher, Madison has made it very clear that she sees my involvement in her wedding as interference rather than generosity. She wanted to plan her own celebration without my input, and now she can do exactly that." "Mom, that doesn't make sense. Madison loves you. She's grateful for everything you've been doing." The innocent belief in his voice reminded me how skillfully Madison had been performing for everyone, not just me. "Son, there are things about Madison's true feelings that would be difficult for you to hear. I overheard her expressing sentiments about me that made it impossible for me to continue funding her wedding." "What kind of sentiments?" I took a deep breath, knowing that once I said these words, there would be no taking them back. "She told a friend that she hoped I would die before the wedding so she wouldn't have to deal with my interference anymore, and so she could inherit my money and plan the wedding she actually wanted." The silence that followed was profound. I could almost hear Christopher's world shifting as he processed what I'd just told him. "Mom, that can't be right. Madison would never say something like that." "I heard her, Christopher. Word for word. She calculated my inheritance value and said my death would solve all her problems. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe she was just venting about stress." The need to protect his daughter was understandable, but it was also exactly what I'd expected. When faced with unpleasant truths about people we love, denial is often the first response. "Christopher, she said she hoped I would die." There's no misunderstanding those words. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Christopher alternating between shock, denial, and desperate attempts to find alternative explanations. Finally, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What do you want from us? What would make you reconsider?" "I don't want anything, son. This isn't about punishment or teaching lessons. This is about self-preservation. I refuse to continue funding someone who wishes I was dead." But what about the family? What about keeping everyone together? The family will be whatever it's going to be. But I won't sacrifice my dignity to maintain relationships with people who don't respect me. Rebecca called next, crying before she even began speaking. Evelyn, please, we need to work this out. Madison made a mistake, but she's young. She didn't mean what she said. Rebecca, she's 24 years old. She's old enough to understand that wishing someone dead while spending their money has consequences. She's devastated. She's been crying for 2 days straight. All her friends know about this wedding. All the plans have been made. All the plans I made. All the contracts I signed. All the money I was spending on someone who saw my death as advantageous. Can't we find some middle ground? Some way to salvage this situation? The situation is already salvaged. I'm no longer financing someone who doesn't appreciate my existence. The most heartbreaking call came from Tyler, Madison's fiancé. His voice was shaky with emotion and confusion. Mrs. Harper, I need you to know that I had no idea Madison felt that way about you. If I had known she said those things, I would never have allowed it. I believed him. Tyler had always seemed genuinely fond of me, and his shock appeared authentic. Tyler, I don't hold you responsible for Madison's choices. But I can't continue funding a celebration for someone who wishes I was dead. Is there anything I can do to fix this? Any way to make it right? That's between you and Madison. But the wedding I was paying for no longer exists. What are we supposed to do? We've told everyone, sent invitations, made all these plans. You'll have to figure that out together. But you'll be doing it without my financial support. The call that revealed the most about Madison's character came from Madison herself, 3 days after the cancellation. Her tone had shifted from panic to anger, and the mask of loving granddaughter had finally slipped completely. Grandma, I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I think you're being incredibly unfair. The audacity took my breath away. Madison was calling me unfair for refusing to fund someone who wished I was dead. Unfair how exactly? You're punishing me for having private feelings. Everyone has thoughts they don't mean when they're stressed. You can't destroy my entire wedding because of one conversation you weren't supposed to hear. Madison, you didn't just have private thoughts. You calculated my inheritance value and wished for my death. Those aren't stress-induced comments. Those are character revelations. I never actually wanted you to die. I was just frustrated with how involved you were in everything. I felt like I was losing control of my own wedding. So you decided the solution was for me to die and leave you my money? That was just me being dramatic with Ashley. I didn't mean it literally. The lie was so transparent, so insulting to my intelligence, that I almost laughed. Madison, you researched my financial situation. You asked your father about my assets. You calculated exactly how much you'd inherit. That level of planning goes well beyond dramatic conversation. I was worried about whether you could afford the wedding. I wanted to make sure you weren't spending money you didn't have. Another lie, delivered with the same confident tone she'd used to deceive me for months. You told Ashley that I was naive about business and that I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. You said you could treat me however you wanted because I'd never do anything to hurt you. Does that sound like worry about my financial well-being? For the first time in the conversation, Madison fell silent. She'd been caught in a web of lies and couldn't find a way out. Grandma, please. I'm sorry about what I said. I'm sorry about all of it. Can't we just move past this? No, Madison, we can't. Some words can't be taken back, and some actions have permanent consequences. So that's it. You're just going to destroy my wedding and our relationship because of one stupid conversation. I'm protecting myself from someone who sees more value in my death than in my life. That's not destruction, that's self-preservation. Everyone thinks you're being crazy and vindictive. Dad thinks you're having some kind of breakdown because you're still grieving Grandpa. The attempt to make me question my own sanity was Madison's final gambit, and it revealed just how manipulative she truly was. Madison, everyone can think whatever they want. I know what I heard, I know what you really think of me. And I know I deserve better than to fund my own humiliation. You're going to regret this. When you're sitting alone in your house while I'm celebrating my wedding, you're going to wish you hadn't been so stubborn. Madison, I'll be on a cruise ship in Alaska, enjoying the luxury suite I purchased with the money I saved by not funding someone who wishes I was dead. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me that information hit its mark. Madison had assumed I'd spend the rest of my life regretting my decision, sitting at home mourning the relationship I'd destroyed. Instead, I'd be celebrating my freedom in the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. You booked a cruise. I booked exactly the kind of experience I've always wanted but never felt I could justify. Turns out, not spending $65,000 on someone who wants me dead freed up quite a bit of discretionary income. I don't want you dead, Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. You hoped I would die before your wedding so you could inherit my money and plan the celebration you actually wanted. I'm just making sure you get to plan your own wedding while I'm very much alive and enjoying myself elsewhere. I hung up and blocked Madison's number, along with several other family members who'd been bombarding me with calls and texts demanding I reconsider my decision. The family crisis I'd precipitated would take years to resolve, if it ever could be resolved. Christopher and Rebecca were torn between supporting their daughter and acknowledging my legitimate grievances. Extended family members were taking sides based on incomplete information and personal loyalties. But for the first time in months I felt peaceful. I'd learned that Madison's love was conditional on my usefulness. I discovered that Christopher and Rebecca would prioritize family harmony over protecting me from disrespect. I'd realized that most of my relatives saw my money as family resources rather than personal assets. All of these revelations were painful, but they were also liberating. I no longer had to pretend that relationships built on deception and exploitation were genuine or valuable. The morning of what should have been Madison's wedding day, I stood on the deck of the luxury cruise ship Northern Star, watching the Alaskan coastline emerge from the early morning mist. The suite I'd booked cost exactly $50,000, $1,000 for every year I'd been alive, and every penny worth the peace I felt watching glaciers calve into the pristine waters. My cabin steward, a young man named David from the Philippines, had been amazed when I told him this was my first cruise. "Ma'am, you picked the most beautiful time to visit Alaska. And this suite, it's one of our finest. Are you celebrating something special?" "I'm celebrating my independence," I'd told him, and the phrase had felt more accurate than any other description I could have offered. Independence from family members who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Independence from the obligation to fund people who didn't respect me. Independence from the belief that love required accepting unacceptable behavior. My phone had been turned off since boarding the ship 3 days earlier. By now, Madison would have had her community center wedding, assuming she'd managed to organize something in the 3 weeks since I'd canceled her dream celebration. I felt no curiosity about how the day had gone, no regret about missing it, no sadness about the relationship I'd severed. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced since William's death, pure joy in my own company and my own choices. The cruise was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. My suite included a private butler, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub, and a balcony where I could sit in the evenings with a glass of wine and watch the sun set over some of the most beautiful scenery on Earth. I joined a small group of solo travelers who met each evening for dinner, and had formed unexpected friendships with people who had fascinating life stories and no hidden agendas regarding my finances. There was Margaret, a retired professor from Portland who'd decided to see Alaska after her husband's death the previous year. Like me, she'd discovered that spending money on herself felt revolutionary after decades of prioritizing other people's needs and desires. "I spent 40 years making sure my children had everything they wanted," she told me over dinner one evening. Piano lessons, college tuition, help with down payments on their houses. When Richard died, I realized I'd never asked myself what I wanted. This cruise is the first purely selfish thing I've done since I was 20. There was Robert, a widower from Chicago who'd sold his business and decided to travel while he was still healthy enough to enjoy it. His adult children had been horrified that he was wasting their inheritance on experiences rather than preserving it for them. "They act like my money is already theirs," he said with a rueful laugh. "They forget that I earned it, and I have every right to spend it on whatever brings me happiness." And there was Dorothy, a never-married retired nurse who'd spent her career caring for others and was now, at 72, finally doing things for her own pleasure. "People always ask me if I regret not having children," she said as we watched whales feeding in the distance. "But look around you. How many of these people with families are here alone because their children couldn't be bothered to travel with them, or couldn't afford to, or just assumed someone else would take care of the elderly parents?" The conversations with my new friends provided perspective I hadn't expected. I wasn't the only person who discovered that family relationships could become sources of exploitation rather than support. I wasn't the only one who'd learned that saying no to unreasonable demands actually strengthened rather than weakened important connections. On the fourth day of the cruise, I finally turned on my phone to check for any urgent messages. There were over 100 missed calls and countless text messages, but as I scrolled through them, I realized none of them were actually urgent. They were just insistent. Christopher had called repeatedly, his messages growing increasingly desperate. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk about this situation." Madison's wedding was a disaster. "She's devastated. The family is falling apart." "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn." "Or family. We should be able to work this out." Rebecca had sent long text messages full of emotional manipulation. "Evelyn, you've always been such a loving grandmother. This isn't like you. Madison made a mistake, but she's learned her lesson. Please don't let pride destroy our family." Everyone at the wedding asked where you were. "It broke my heart to tell them you'd chosen not to come." Madison cried through the entire ceremony. Even Tyler had reached out. "Mrs. Harper, I know you're angry, but Madison really is sorry. She loves you so much. Isn't there some way to fix this?" But the message that revealed the most came from Madison herself, sent the night before her wedding. "Grandma, tomorrow I'm getting married in a community center with plastic flowers and a potluck reception. All because you decided to be vindictive over something I said when I was stressed. Hope you're happy. You've ruined the most important day of my life, and I'll never forgive you for it." I read the message twice, marveling at Madison's ability to cast herself as the victim even now. She'd spent months planning to benefit from my death while accepting my generosity, but I was the vindictive one for refusing to continue funding her. She'd calculated my inheritance value while dismissing my business experience, but I was the one who'd ruined her special day by protecting myself from further disrespect. The complete lack of genuine remorse, the absence of any acknowledgement that her behavior had been unacceptable, told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd made the right decision. I deleted all the messages without responding and turned off my phone again. That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the aurora borealis dance across the Arctic sky, I called Marcus Stone from the ship's phone. "Evelyn, how's the cruise? I have to admit, when you told me you were booking Alaska instead of attending the wedding, I thought you were making the most elegant statement possible." "Marcus, it's been incredible. But I'm calling about something else. I want to update my will." "What kind of changes are you considering?" "Madison's inheritance needs to be redirected. I want to establish scholarships for young women starting their own businesses, and I want to increase my donations to organizations that support elderly people who've been exploited by family members." "Evelyn, are you sure about this? Changing your will in response to current family tensions might not be the best long-term strategy." "Marcus, this isn't about family tensions. This is about character assessment. Madison showed me who she really is, and I believe her. My assets should go to people who will appreciate them and use them constructively." "What about Christopher? How do you want to handle his portion of the estate?" I'd been thinking about this question since the day I cancelled the wedding. Christopher had been caught between his mother and his daughter, And while his attempts to minimize Madison's behavior had been disappointing, they'd also been understandable. Christopher's inheritance remains unchanged. He's been a good son overall, even if his judgment about his daughter's character has been lacking. But Madison's portion goes to the scholarship fund. I'll draft the amendments and have them ready for your signature when you return. Evelyn, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you have any regrets about how you handled the wedding situation? I watched the northern lights pulse and shimmer above the ship, nature's own celebration of beauty and power, and considered Marcus's question carefully. My only regret is that it took me so long to recognize what Madison was really like. I should have seen through her performance months ago. And the family relationships that have been damaged. Marcus, relationships built on deception and exploitation aren't actually valuable. Losing them isn't damage. It's clarity. When I returned from Alaska 2 weeks later, I found my house exactly as I'd left it, but I felt transformed by the experience. I'd proven to myself that I could find joy and fulfillment without needing other people's approval or gratitude. The travel bug had bitten me hard. I immediately began planning my next adventure, a river cruise through Europe in the fall, followed by a winter in a luxury resort in Costa Rica. At 68, I was finally living the kind of life I'd always imagined but never allowed myself to pursue. The financial freedom to travel came directly from my decision to stop funding Madison's ingratitude. The emotional freedom came from recognizing that I deserved better treatment than I'd been accepting. There were more attempts at reconciliation over the following months. Christopher continued calling, suggesting family counseling and gradual rebuilding of relationships. Rebecca sent cards on holidays, always with messages about family forgiveness and moving forward. Madison herself made one final attempt at contact, 6 months after her community center wedding. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered before realizing who it was. "Grandma, please don't hang up. I need to talk to you." "Madison, I have nothing to say to you. I'm sorry. I'm truly, genuinely sorry for what I said. I was wrong and I hurt you and I want to make it right. Are you sorry you said it, or are you sorry I heard it?" The question caught her off guard, and the pause told me everything I needed to know. I'm sorry for all of it. For thinking those things, for saying them, for not appreciating everything you did for me. Madison, you calculated my inheritance value and said you hoped I would die so you could benefit from it. Those aren't thoughts that come from stress, they come from character. And character doesn't change just because plans don't work out. People can change, Grandma. I've learned from this experience. What have you learned exactly? I've learned that I took you for granted. That I should have been more grateful for your generosity. It was the wrong answer, focused entirely on what I'd done for her rather than on what she'd done to me. Madison still saw our relationship primarily in terms of what I could provide, not how family members should treat each other. Madison, the problem wasn't that you took my generosity for granted. The problem was that you wished I was dead. Until you understand the difference between those two things, we have nothing to discuss. I hung up and blocked the number she'd called from. 2 years after canceling Madison's wedding, I was living a life I never could have imagined during my decades as a restaurant owner and devoted grandmother. I'd traveled to 15 countries, learned to paint watercolors, taken up ballroom dancing, and discovered that I had interests and talents that had been dormant for decades. My travel companions had become some of my closest friends. Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, and I had formed what we jokingly called the Liberation Society. A group of people who'd learned to prioritize their own well-being after decades of putting others first. We met monthly for dinner when we were all in town, sharing stories of our adventures and supporting each other through the ongoing family dramas that seemed to accompany late-life independence. My daughter called yesterday to complain that I'm spending her inheritance on frivolous travel, Dorothy reported during one of our dinners. I told her that since she hasn't spoken to me voluntarily in 3 years, she should probably assume there is no inheritance. Robert's son is still furious that he sold the family business instead of passing it down, Margaret added. Apparently, being a successful entrepreneur for 40 years doesn't give you the right to make your own decisions about your assets. These conversations helped me understand that my experience with Madison wasn't unique or unusual. Many elderly people faced pressure from family members who saw their resources as somehow belonging to the whole family rather than to the person who'd earned them. The difference was that I'd decided to protect myself instead of accepting exploitation as the price of family harmony. My relationship with Christopher had gradually improved, though it would never return to its previous closeness. He'd eventually acknowledged that Madison's behavior had been unacceptable, even if he couldn't bring himself to fully support my response to it. "Mom, I understand why you felt you had to take action," he'd said during one of our monthly lunches. "I just wish there had been some other way to handle it that didn't tear the family apart." "Christopher, I didn't tear the family apart. Madison's behavior did that. I just refused to pretend it hadn't happened. I know intellectually, but emotionally, it's hard to accept that my daughter is capable of the kind of callousness you described." I understood his struggle. It had taken me months to fully accept that the granddaughter I'd loved so deeply was capable of wishing for my death while accepting my generosity. Denial is a powerful force when the truth is too painful to bear. But I'd also learned that accepting painful truths was the only way to make decisions that honored my own dignity and well-being. Madison had married Tyler in the community center as planned, and by all accounts they seemed happy enough. She'd found a job with better pay and had managed to buy a small house with Tyler's help. Her life had continued without my financial support, proving that her dependence on me had been a choice rather than a necessity. I heard updates through Christopher, who remained in contact with his daughter despite the awkwardness of the situation. Madison had never attempted to contact me again after that final phone call, which I interpreted as evidence that she'd finally understood I meant what I said. The scholarship fund I'd established in place of Madison's inheritance had awarded its first grants the previous fall. 5 young women had received funding to start their own businesses, and their thank you letters reminded me why I'd made the change. Mrs. Harper, your scholarship has made it possible for me to start the bakery I've dreamed of since I was a child. I promise to honor your generosity by building something that will employ other women and serve our community. I never expected anyone to believe in my business idea enough to provide funding. Your scholarship has changed my life, and I will never forget your faith in me. These letters gave me more satisfaction than funding Madison's wedding ever had. These young women appreciated the opportunity they'd been given and were using it to create value for themselves and others. Madison had seen my money as something she was entitled to, something that existed primarily to serve her desires. These scholarship recipients understood it as a gift that carried responsibilities and opportunities. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. On my 70th birthday, I threw myself a party at the most exclusive restaurant in Springfield. I invited my travel friends, some neighbors who'd become dear to me, and a few long-time acquaintances who'd always treated me with genuine respect. Christopher and Rebecca attended, though the conversation was somewhat strained. They'd clearly hoped the passage of time would heal the family rift, and my continued independence and happiness made it difficult to maintain the narrative that I was a bitter old woman who'd overreacted to Madison's behavior. "Mom, you look incredible," Rebecca said as we sat at the beautifully decorated table I'd reserved for 12. "This whole lifestyle change has been amazing for you." "Thank you, Rebecca. It turns out that living for myself agrees with me. Do you ever miss the way things used to be?" It was the closest she'd come to directly asking whether I regretted my decision about Madison's wedding. "I miss the person I thought Madison was," I said honestly. "But I don't miss being taken advantage of or disrespected. I don't miss funding people who don't appreciate me." Christopher raised his wine glass in a toast that surprised me with its sincerity. "To Mom, who taught us all that it's never too late to demand better treatment, even when that lesson is hard to learn." It was the closest he'd come to fully acknowledging that my response to Madison's behavior had been justified, and I appreciated the gesture more than I'd expected to. As the evening wound down and my guests began to leave, Dorothy lingered behind to help me collect the flowers and leftover cake. Evelyn, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd confronted Madison directly instead of just canceling everything? I'd thought about this question many times over the past 2 years, especially in the early days when the family pressure to reconcile had been most intense. Dorothy, I think confronting her would have led to promises and apologies and temporary behavior changes, followed by a return to the same disrespectful patterns once she felt secure again. Madison didn't accidentally wish I was dead. She revealed her true character in that conversation. But don't you think people can change? I think people can choose to behave differently when it serves their interests. But fundamental character traits like empathy and respect for others are usually pretty well established by age 24. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. I ask because my own granddaughter has been making some troubling comments about my financial decisions. Nothing as extreme as what Madison said to you, but what kind of comments? Questioning why I need such a large house when I live alone. Suggesting that my travel expenses are excessive for someone my age. Hinting that I should be thinking more about what I'm leaving to family instead of spending so much on myself. I'd heard variations of this story from several of my elderly friends. Adult children and grandchildren who felt entitled to comment on, and ultimately control, their relatives' financial decisions. Dorothy, how do those comments make you feel? Guilty. Selfish. Like maybe I am being irresponsible with money that could help my family. Whose money is it? Well, it's mine, but. No buts. Whose money is it? Mine. And who earned it? I did. 40 years as a nurse, plus my late husband's pension and our investments. So you have every right to spend it however makes you happy, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Dorothy smiled ruefully. I know that intellectually. But emotionally, it's hard to ignore family pressure. Dorothy, I spent months ignoring my own discomfort with Madison's behavior because I didn't want to rock the family boat. I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner instead of waiting until I overheard something so blatant I couldn't rationalize it away. You think I should be more direct with my granddaughter? I think you should trust your feelings about her comments. If they make you uncomfortable, there's probably a good reason for that discomfort. This conversation reminded me why I'd become so passionate about supporting elderly people who faced exploitation by family members. The manipulation was often subtle, couched in terms of concern or practical planning, but the underlying message was always the same. Elderly people should prioritize their family's financial interests over their own happiness and autonomy. I'd learned that rejecting this premise was both liberating and necessary for maintaining dignity and self-respect in later life. 3 years after the cancelled wedding, I received a call that I'd been expecting but still dreaded. Christopher's voice was shaky when he delivered the news. Mom, Madison is pregnant. She and Tyler are having a baby. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for a new life coming into the world, sadness that I wouldn't be part of this child's story, and determination not to let family pressure manipulate me into resuming a relationship with Madison. That's wonderful news, Christopher. I'm sure they'll be good parents. Mom, don't you think? Wouldn't this be a good opportunity to heal the family? To let go of old hurts and start fresh? I'd been anticipating this conversation for months, knowing that a grandchild would be used as emotional leverage to pressure me into reconciliation. Christopher, I'm happy for Madison and Tyler. But having a baby doesn't erase Madison's character or change what she revealed about her feelings toward me. But children change people. Becoming a parent gives you new perspective on relationships and family. Sometimes that's true. But fundamental character traits usually remain consistent. Madison showed me who she really is, and I believed her. The baby will be your great-grandchild, Mom. Don't you want to be part of their life? The question hit harder than I'd expected. Of course I wanted to know my great-grandchild, to share stories and create memories and provide the kind of love I'd once given Madison. But I'd also learned that love without boundaries was just enabling, and that family relationships required mutual respect to be healthy. Christopher, I would love to have a relationship with Madison's child. But that would require Madison to acknowledge what she did wrong and demonstrate genuine change in how she treats people she claims to love. What would that look like to you? I'd thought about this question extensively, especially after Dorothy's situation with her granddaughter had evolved in similar directions. It would require Madison to take full responsibility for wishing I was dead while accepting my generosity, without excuses or justifications. It would require her to understand why that was deeply wrong, not just inappropriate. And it would require her to demonstrate over time that she's genuinely changed her perspective on how family members should treat each other. That's a pretty high bar, Mom. Christopher, she wished I was dead so she could inherit my money. Is acknowledging that wrong really too much to ask before allowing her back into my life? The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Christopher alternating between understanding my position and hoping I'd soften it for the sake of family unity. Eventually, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. What should I tell Madison? She's hoping the baby will bring you two back together. Tell Madison that I wish her well, that I hope she has a healthy pregnancy and delivery, and that if she ever wants to have a genuine conversation about what happened between us, she knows how to reach me. After hanging up, I sat in my sunroom looking at the garden William and I had planted decades ago. Some of the original plants were still thriving, while others had been replaced over the years as conditions changed and my preferences evolved. The garden was a metaphor for my life in many ways. The foundational elements remained strong. My values, my independence, my capacity for love and joy. But I'd learned to remove the plants that weren't thriving, that took more energy than they provided, that crowded out the flowers that brought me genuine happiness. Madison had been like a diseased plant that I'd kept trying to nurture, hoping it would recover and bloom. Instead, it had continued to drain resources while poisoning the soil around it. Removing it from my garden hadn't been cruel. It had been necessary for the health of everything else. That evening, I called Margaret to talk through my feelings about the pregnancy news. "Oh, Evelyn, that must be so complicated for you," she said immediately. "Part of you must be thrilled about a great-grandchild, and part of you must be terrified of the pressure to reconcile." Exactly. I keep imagining this innocent child caught in the middle of adult conflicts they had nothing to do with. But you also can't pretend Madison's character has changed just because she's having a baby. That's what I keep coming back to. Becoming a parent doesn't automatically make someone a better person, and it certainly doesn't erase the fact that she wished I was dead. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What does your gut tell you to do?" My gut tells me to wait and see if Madison demonstrates genuine change over time. Not just apologies or promises, but actual behavioral changes that show she understands what she did wrong. And if she doesn't, then I'll have to accept that my great-grandchild will grow up not knowing me, just like Madison's child will grow up with a mother who saw her grandmother's death as financially advantageous. It was a heartbreaking reality, but it was also the natural consequence of Madison's choices. I couldn't protect the next generation from their parents' character flaws by pretending those flaws didn't exist. 6 months later, I received a birth announcement in the mail. Baby Emma, born healthy and beautiful, parents thrilled and grateful. The photo showed Madison holding her daughter with an expression of wonder I remembered from her own childhood. Inside the card was a handwritten note. *, Grandma Evelyn, I know we haven't spoken in years, but I wanted you to know that Emma is here and she's perfect. Every day since she was born, I think about what kind of mother I want to be. And I remember all the things you taught me about love and sacrifice and putting family first. I hope someday you'll want to meet your great-granddaughter. Love, Madison. The note was carefully crafted to tug at my heartstrings without actually acknowledging what had caused our estrangement. Madison referenced what I'd taught her about love and sacrifice, while conveniently omitting the fact that she'd dismissed those lessons when they became inconvenient for her. But I also recognized something different in the tone. Less manipulation, more genuine emotion. Perhaps becoming a mother had begun to change Madison's perspective on family relationships. I wrote back, the first communication between us in over 3 years. Dear Madison, congratulations on Emma's birth. She's beautiful, and I can see the joy in your eyes in the photograph. Becoming a parent is a transformative experience that often helps us understand our own parents and grandparents better. If you ever want to have an honest conversation about what happened between us, not to resume our relationship immediately, but to understand whether genuine healing is possible, I'm willing to listen. I hope you're enjoying motherhood. Sincerely, Grandma Evelyn *. I chose sincerely instead of love deliberately. Love would return if and when Madison demonstrated that she deserved it, but sincerity was something I could offer regardless of our personal relationship. 2 weeks later, Madison called. "Grandma, it's me. Madison. Hey, I got your note, and I'd like to talk if you're willing." Her voice was different, quieter, less confident, more vulnerable than the assured young woman who'd wished for my death 3 years earlier. "I'm willing to listen, Madison. I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago, and I need to say it without excuses or explanations, because I finally understand what I did to you." This opening surprised me. The Madison I remembered always led with justifications and circumstances that minimized her responsibility. "I'm listening. I said I hoped you would die before my wedding so I could inherit your money and plan the wedding I wanted without your interference. That was cruel, calculated, and unforgivable. I spent months accepting your generosity while privately resenting you for caring about the event you were funding. I dismissed your business experience, excluded you from decisions about your own money, and treated you like an embarrassing burden instead of the loving grandmother who was making my dreams possible." I sat in stunned silence. This level of acknowledgement was more than I'd ever expected to hear from Madison. I told myself I was just venting, just stressed, just overwhelmed. But the truth is, I was selfish and entitled, and I saw you as an obstacle to getting what I wanted instead of as a person who deserved respect and gratitude. "Madison, please let me finish. Since Emma was born, I think about you every day. When I'm up at 3 in the morning feeding her, I remember all the times you must have done the same thing with me when Dad and Mom were working. When she smiles at me like I'm the most important person in her world, I think about how I must have looked at you the same way before I became so focused on myself that I forgot to value the people who loved me." There was pain in her voice now, real remorse that felt different from her previous attempts at reconciliation. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to welcome me back into your life like nothing happened. But I need you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and I'm horrified by the person I became. You didn't ruin my wedding. I ruined our relationship. You didn't tear apart our family. I did that when I decided your money was more valuable than your love." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Madison taking responsibility for specific incidents I'd forgotten and acknowledging the depth of pain her betrayal had caused. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't request money, didn't make any demands at all. Instead, she talked about what motherhood had taught her about unconditional love and sacrifice, and how those lessons had made her realize how completely she'd failed to appreciate those qualities in me. "Grandma, I know I don't deserve another chance, but if you're ever willing to meet Emma, I promise I will never again take your love for granted or treat your generosity as something I'm entitled to." "Madison, this conversation is very different from the ones we had before. What's changed?" "Everything. Having Emma made me understand what it means to love someone more than yourself. And understanding that made me realize how much you must have loved me to keep giving even when I was treating you badly. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm trying every day to become someone worthy of the love you used to have for me." After we hung up, I sat in my garden thinking about redemption and second chances and the difference between apologies that ask for something and apologies that acknowledge harm. Madison's call felt genuine in a way her previous attempts at reconciliation had not. She'd taken full responsibility, shown understanding of the impact her behavior had on me, and made no requests for immediate restoration of our relationship. But I'd also learned to trust slowly and verify character changes over time rather than accepting promises at face value. I called Margaret to process the conversation. "It sounds like Madison has genuinely begun to understand what she did wrong," Margaret said thoughtfully. "But understanding and change are two different things." "Exactly. I want to believe she's different, but I also need to see consistent evidence of that change before I risk being hurt again." "What would that evidence look like?" "Patience with my pace of healing. respect for the boundaries I need to maintain, understanding that trust has to be rebuilt slowly, and most importantly, treating me with genuine appreciation rather than entitled expectation if I do choose to engage with her and Emma. Over the following months, Madison proved remarkably patient. She sent occasional updates about Emma's milestones but never pressured me for responses. She called on my birthday to wish me well but didn't ask about reconciliation. She sent a Christmas card with a photo of Emma but included no requests for visits or gifts. The restraint was so different from her previous behavior that I began to believe the changes might be real. 6 months after our phone conversation, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to Madison's house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, my heart pounding with nervousness and hope in equal measure. When she opened the door, Madison's face cycled through shock, joy, and caution before settling on careful welcome. "Grandma, come in, please." The house was small but clean and comfortable, decorated with photos of Emma and evidence of the financial constraints I knew Madison and Tyler still lived with. There were no signs of extravagance or entitlement, just the simple life of a young family making their way in the world. Emma was 8 months old, sitting in a high chair covered in what appeared to be pureed vegetables. When she saw me, she smiled and babbled, extending her small hands in universal baby language for, "Pick me up." The sight of my great-granddaughter, William's great-granddaughter, brought tears to my eyes. "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward Emma. "Of course," Madison said, lifting Emma from her high chair and gently placing her in my arms. Holding Emma felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever. She had Madison's eyes but Tyler's gentle temperament, and she seemed perfectly content to be held by this stranger who was actually family. "She's beautiful, Madison. Absolutely beautiful. She looks like you did as a baby, actually." Dad showed me some old photos, and the resemblance is striking. We spent 2 hours together that afternoon, talking about Emma's development, Madison's adjustment to motherhood, and Tyler's new job that was finally providing financial stability. Madison never asked for anything, never mentioned money or gifts or support. She simply shared her life with me and seemed genuinely grateful that I was there. As I prepared to leave, Madison walked me to the door with Emma in her arms. "Grandma, thank you for coming. It means more than I can express. Madison, I need you to understand that this is the beginning of rebuilding trust, not an instant return to our old relationship. I understand completely. I'm grateful for any relationship you're willing to consider. I also need you to know that the financial support I once provided is not part of this. You've built a good life on your own, and that's important for both of us. I wouldn't accept financial help even if you offered it. I need to know that any relationship we build is based on love, not money." This response told me more about Madison's growth than any words could have. The young woman who'd once calculated my inheritance value now refused financial assistance to preserve the integrity of our potential relationship. As I drove home, I reflected on the afternoon's revelations. Madison had demonstrated patience, humility, and genuine change. She'd built a stable life without my financial support, learned to appreciate relationships for their emotional rather than material value, and shown real understanding of what had gone wrong between us. Most importantly, she'd proven that people could change when the motivation was genuine and the commitment was sustained. #epilogue. Full circle. 5 years after canceling Madison's dream wedding, I stood in the same kitchen where I'd first overheard her devastating conversation, this time preparing bottles for Emma while Madison finished getting ready for work. The reconciliation had been slow and careful, built on consistent demonstrations of changed behavior rather than promises or apologies. Madison had earned back my trust through patience, respect, and genuine appreciation for the relationship we were rebuilding. Emma, now 3 years old, called me Gigi, and spent 2 afternoons a week at my house while Madison worked. These days filled me with the kind of joy I'd thought was lost forever when I learned what Madison really thought of me. But the joy was different now. More precious because it was grounded in authentic relationship rather than obligation, more meaningful because it existed alongside maintained boundaries and self-respect. Madison had never asked for financial help, even during difficult periods. She'd built her career, saved for Emma's education, and created the kind of stable family life that demonstrated her growth as a person. The young woman who'd once seen my money as her entitlement had become someone who valued independence and earned success. "Gigi, can we go to the park today?" Emma asked, looking up at me with eyes that held all the innocence and trust one remembered from Madison's childhood. "Of course, sweetheart. After your mommy leaves for work, we'll go feed the ducks." Madison emerged from the bathroom, dressed for her job as a marketing manager at a non-profit organization, work she'd chosen specifically because she wanted to contribute something meaningful to the world. "Mom, are you sure watching Emma isn't too much? I can ask Tyler's mother if you need a break." This consideration was typical of the new Madison, always aware of others' needs and boundaries, never taking anyone's generosity for granted. "Madison, I'm 73 years old, not 93. I can handle an afternoon with my great-granddaughter. I know I never want to assume or take advantage." The careful concern in her voice reminded me daily of how completely she'd internalized the lessons from our estrangement. She'd learned that relationships required mutual respect and genuine appreciation, not just shared DNA and good intentions. After Madison left for work, Emma and I settled into our routine. We played with blocks, read stories, and talked about everything and nothing in the way that makes spending time with small children such a joy. "Gigi, why don't I have other grandparents?" Emma asked during lunch, a question I'd been expecting but dreading. "You have Grandpa Christopher and Grandma Rebecca, sweetheart. They love you very much. But Mommy said there was another grandma before you. Where did she go?" Madison had prepared me for this conversation, explaining that Emma had overheard adult discussions about family relationships and was trying to make sense of complicated dynamics. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that take a long time to solve, honey. But the important thing is that people who love each other find ways to be together when they're both ready." It was a simplified version of the truth, but age-appropriate and accurate enough for a 3-year-old's understanding. "Are you and Mommy ready now?" "Yes, sweetheart. We're ready now." That evening, after Madison picked up Emma and they went home to their dinner routine with Tyler, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd learned that love without boundaries was enabling, not kindness. I'd discovered that self-respect was more valuable than family harmony built on pretense. I'd proven to myself that it was never too late to demand better treatment and create a life based on authentic relationships rather than obligations. The 5 years since canceling Madison's wedding had been the most fulfilling of my life. I'd traveled extensively, developed new friendships, pursued interests I'd never allowed myself time for, and ultimately rebuilt a relationship with Madison that was stronger because it was based on mutual respect rather than assumed entitlement. My financial situation had also improved dramatically. The money I'd saved by not funding Madison's first wedding, combined with smart investments and reduced spending on people who didn't appreciate me, had grown into a substantial nest egg that provided both security and freedom. I'd used some of those resources to establish a foundation supporting elderly people who faced exploitation by family members. The work had connected me with others who'd faced similar challenges and had given purpose to the pain of my experience with Madison. The scholarship fund I'd created in place of Madison's original inheritance had now helped 23 young women start their own businesses. Their success stories provided ongoing evidence that investing in people who appreciated opportunities was more rewarding than funding those who saw generosity as their due. Madison, knowing about both the foundation and the scholarship fund, had never expressed resentment about the redirection of what she'd once expected to inherit. Instead, she'd volunteered her marketing skills to help promote both causes, contributing her talents rather than expecting financial benefit. This shift in perspective from "what can I get" to "what can I give" represented the most fundamental change in Madison's character. My relationship with Christopher and Rebecca had also stabilized, though it remained different from what it had been before. They'd eventually acknowledged that my response to Madison's behavior had been justified, even if they'd initially found it extreme. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Christopher had said during one of our recent monthly dinners. "You were protecting yourself from behavior that was genuinely unacceptable, and we should have supported you instead of pressuring you to accept mistreatment for the sake of family peace." The vindication had been welcome, but it had also come too late to change my fundamental understanding of family dynamics. I'd learned that even well-meaning relatives would often prioritize harmony over justice when conflicts arose. This knowledge hadn't made me bitter, but it had made me more selective about whose opinions I valued and whose pressure I allowed to influence my decisions. As the evening stars appeared in the darkening sky, I reflected on the most important lesson from my experience: that dignity and self-respect were not luxuries to be sacrificed for family relationships, but requirements for healthy relationships of any kind. Madison's transformation had been possible only because I'd refused to continue funding her disrespect. If I'd accepted her death wish as stress-induced poor judgment, if I'd continued paying for her wedding while absorbing her contempt, nothing would have changed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal causes short-term pain for everyone involved. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Emma had so much fun with you today. Thank you for being such an amazing Gigi. She's lucky to have you, and so am I." I smiled and typed back, "I'm lucky to have both of you too. See you Thursday for our usual afternoon." The easy exchange reflected the comfortable relationship we'd built, one based on mutual appreciation, clear boundaries, and genuine affection rather than guilt, obligation, or financial entanglement. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I'd never expected to experience again after that devastating day when I'd overheard Madison's death wish: complete peace with my family relationships. Not because all conflicts had been resolved, but because all my relationships were now authentic. The people in my life were there because they chose to be, because they valued me as a person rather than as a resource. Madison had earned her way back into my heart through consistent demonstration of changed character. Emma brought me joy because our relationship was built on natural affection rather than assumed obligation. My travel friends supported me because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Even Christopher and Rebecca, though our relationship remained somewhat cautious, treated me with the respect I'd learned to demand from everyone in my life. The woman who'd once accepted disrespect in exchange for the privilege of giving generously had been replaced by someone who understood that true generosity could only exist within relationships built on mutual respect. At 73, I was finally living the life I'd always deserved but had never known how to claim. It had taken Madison's betrayal to teach me that love and respect were not mutually exclusive, that boundaries and affection could coexist, that demanding better treatment ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the relationships that mattered. The wedding that never was had become the catalyst for the life that finally could be, one built on authenticity, self-respect, and the hard-won knowledge that it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience, truth over harmony, and genuine love over its manipulative counterfeit. Madison's dream wedding had cost $80,000 and would have lasted one day. The life I'd built in its place was priceless and would last whatever time I had remaining, time that would be spent with people who truly valued my presence rather than calculating the benefits of my absence. In the end, canceling that wedding had been the most expensive and most worthwhile investment I'd ever made in my own happiness. If you enjoyed this story of family betrayal, redemption, and the power of maintaining dignity at any age, please subscribe for more stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when faced with impossible situations. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and self-respect? What would you have done in Evelyn's situation? Asterisk.